Welcome, everyone, to another speaker series. This is another wonderful person that I get to introduce for our DreamHour Descendant Speaker Series. I am here today with Dr. Carmen Tafolla, and my name is Tiffany Smith. I will be your host for this lecture. And let me just give you a quick little bio on Dr. Tafolla. Dr. Tafolla is the State Poet Laureate of Texas 2015. She is the first Poet Laureate of the City of San Antonio 2013 through 2014, and formerly president of the Texas Institute of Letters. She is also an author of more than 30 books. Her latest poetry book is Carmen Tafolla, New and Selected Works. A native of the West Side barrios of San Antonio, her family has been in San Antonio since before it was even named San Antonio. She has been recognized by the National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies for work which gives voice to the peoples and cultures of this land. So that was a wonderful bio. I'm so honored to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I really think it's so wonderful that our whole community and our extended community, people from outside the city of San Antonio, can join in on these events, looking at how our community, where its roots are and where its dreams go to. And that whole trajectory from where we came from and where we're headed to becomes a communal dream. It becomes something that brings us all to our highest potential. Now, I'm here to present to you my little sliver, my perspective on how we get disappeared. Now, I did say get disappeared. I didn't say got disappeared, because it's still happening. But for peoples of color throughout the world, it seems that there are certain tactics that are used to disappear us from importance, from significance, sometimes from even people's awareness that we're there at all. And this is much of what happened to the Texan Indian. There are many, many Texan Indians living in San Antonio and in Texas and in the United States today. But they don't always know that they're Indian. They got disappeared. In San Antonio, most of the Texan Indians know themselves as Mexican Americans. And I'm a Mexican American. I grew up on the west side of San Antonio. I grew up in the barrios. I identify as Mexican American. I speak English and Spanish. But there is that family heritage that goes back that isn't always talked about. That sometimes we have to dig a little to find out where the origins are in our past experience. And I'll give you really specific examples of that, both from other families in San Antonio and from my own. You might look at me and say, she doesn't look Indian and she doesn't look Mexican. I know, esa es pura española. People will say, trying to be very, complimentary, they think, by claiming only the European side of my ancestry. And I say, rather than embarrass them by saying you don't know much about genetics, I just say, no, I just come from a long line of recessive genes, which is the reality. Color is not always the indicator of our origins. So what we have happening in many, many families are different social experiences that have suppressed or erased or pushed aside or shamed people into not claiming that ancestry. I'm going to go to a little PowerPoint of pictures that may help explain some of this in a, let's see, so I'm going to push share. There we go. Okay. All right. This presentation goes in and out of specifically the indigenous origins in San Antonio. And there are indigenous origins within the Black population, within the white population, within the Mexican American population. And we don't always know about them. There are many different ways. Today, I'm just going to focus on about 6 ways that we have been disappeared out of history. And I'm very fond of saying that, you know, we as peoples of color are magic. We can walk right through an American history textbook and poof, we just disappear. And this is how we disappear. First of all, who's writing the history textbook? And what do the official histories say? When we look at the official histories in this area, they're being written by English-speaking modern Texans. Sometimes they were written by American immigrants to Mexico. People forget that the heroes of the Alamo were not known as heroes of Mexico. They were known as rebels because they were immigrants to Mexico. They had promised to follow the rules of Mexico. The new Republic of Mexico, very brand new nation, had outlawed slavery. But the immigrants coming in from Kentucky and Tennessee and what's now known as the Deep South of the US owned usually many slaves, brought them with them, and then wanted to purchase more and bring them to their new nation, which forbade slavery. We don't always hear that story about the Battle of the Alamo. We don't always hear that about our Texas history. We hear about the brave defenders who fought for freedom. Well, we have to ask, whose freedom? Were they fighting for their own? Were they fighting for their slaves' freedom? Were they fighting for the freedom of the indigenous peoples that were there when they came, or of the Spanish speakers who had a government that had welcomed them in as immigrants? So just a little reminder that we have to be very careful when we look at official histories to make sure that we understand the other side of the story. And in the textbooks that we currently encounter, the Indians, if they appear at all, are usually in the very first chapter, and then they disappear. You know, John Wayne comes and kills them all, and they're all gone. And so that sometimes becomes people's assumption that there aren't any Indians around anymore. Another way that this happens, the disappearing people, is through legislation. And I'm going to show you very specifically a declaration by the Republic of Texas, basically declaring that all Indians west of the Guadalupe River, which was the bulk of the Indian population of Texas, would from henceforth be considered a part of the Mexican people. So they were designated, they were defined as being Mexican. That does real damage when you uproot people, take away their ability to even claim their own heritage. There are examples of belittling, stereotyping, simplifying, demonizing, denigrating a population. And we're going to see some photos of that. Or shaming people into not wanting to claim a certain heritage. For instance, when they use the term puro indio in Mexico, it's not always a compliment. It is sometimes a form of denigrating a person to call them pure Indian. And it has other implications. You know, you're stupid, you're lazy, the usual things that are assigned to people of minority status worldwide. And by minority status, I'm not talking numbers. I'm talking a minority of the power, of the political and economic power of an area. So shaming is one of the things that's used. Sometimes it's things like improvement and development that wipe out an entire history and try to pretend it's not there. But maybe one of the greatest losses that can happen is the loss of family stories, because often it is through those stories that we discover our roots. Now, for those who think Mexican Americans don't have any indigenous background in Texas, I was at a family reunion of the Bernal family, and this was my husband's family, and everybody was bringing in their pictures, and I had volunteered to put them together into a PowerPoint. And so cousin Enrique says, Here's a picture of Cristobal's mother. And I said, who's Cristobal? And Cristobal was my grandpa. And this is Cristobal's mom, my great grandmother. And I said, where is she from? He said, Eagle Pass. She'd been in Eagle Pass forever. She's full-blooded Kickapoo. And some of the finer elements of the family, the well-dressed, socially mobile, upwardly mobile, economically, members of the family said, well, we don't know that that's true. And he said, that's what my grandma told me, and that's what my grandpa told me, and that's what I believe. So this is one example of family stories that if Enrique wouldn't have said, yes, this woman is a Kickapoo Indian, and she is my great-grandmother, and she, in Texas began to be known as Mexican, you wouldn't have had that verification. You wouldn't have had that that lineage that goes back, that tells people, who came from where. Some people, like the American Indians of Texas at the Spanish colonial missions, have a wonderful, wonderful tour that they give of the missions. They sponsor many, many events. And one of the things that they do is bring people back to an awareness of their families, their ancestors, which are often shared in common with other individuals. This is Mickey's great-grandmother. And she was a member of the Espada Indians, and he can still go by and point to which house was hers that is still standing in front of the missions. They too were into tattooing, and you see certain similarities here between these tattoos and the tattoos of the Maori. The Republic of Texas. We were a nation here. Yes, we think we're a whole another country because we were at one point. And so the Republic of Texas in 1837 declares that there's no such thing as Indians anymore. They're all Mexicans. It simplifies racism and it simplifies discrimination, but it doesn't change the reality. We mentioned shaming. This is a picture from 1934, J.T. Brackenridge Elementary School, currently across from the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, in which they took all the children that were there in that school, most of them were Mexican American, and they said, we're going to do a play, but we're going to give you a play with parts that you can really be effective in. And so they made this play about the Indians, and then they made them stand in a very stereotypic manner and laugh at them, I'm sure, instead of recognizing Indigenous heritage as something vital and alive and dynamic and changing and not at all static or stereotypic. This is a picture of Tia Siria. If you get to speaking to family members, you will find that they have many, many stories that people have not always stopped to record. I've always been a fan of talking to the older members of families and recording their stories. And so I got a lot of stories from Tia Siria that her own children and grandchildren had not gotten. And she started to pull out the pictures from her album. This is a picture of her when she was baptized at age 1. And I asked her where her family came from. And she says, well, we're from here. We're from Texas. We've always been from Texas. We're from this area. It didn't matter which side of the border you were on, but it was this area. And I said, do you think that it was indigenous? And she says, pues quién sabe? I don't know. And so this was where it stood. So we went a little deeper into into her trunk of pictures. And here's a picture of her mother holding her first child, holding Tia Siria's first child. So it becomes the grandmother holding the granddaughter. And this was at her house near Eagle Pass. And look at the house. Look at the construction on the house. It's a traditional jacal built by indigenous peoples in this area for centuries. So many families will tell you, well, we don't know no. Oh, we don't think we're Indian. Nobody ever said we were Indian. It's just, pues, quién sabe? Who knows? This is Greg Gomez, Lipan Apache from South Texas also. And Greg's story is an interesting one of how family stories sometimes get hidden either out of shame or out of fear or out of threat. Greg grew up Mexican-American, spoke Spanish, the last name Gomez, no question, brothers and sisters, everybody was very Mexican-American. And one day his grandfather sat him down and said, I have a story to tell you. And he told him a horrible story of what had happened to Greg's great-grandfather, the man's own father. And it had been such a terrifying story and such a terrifying experience that he did not feel he could tell anybody who could not be trusted, and he could not tell anybody who was too young. So as he watched his grandsons grow up, he selected Greg, who he figured could do the right thing with this information. And he waited till he was 17 or 18 years old to tell him the story of a horrible lynching, mutilation that had occurred because his great-grandfather was Indian. So even claiming that identity could threaten your life. It didn't matter if you were Indian, you just couldn't claim to be Indian, because if you were thought of as Indian, you were thought of as savage, and therefore often tragedies did occur. So I was raised in the West Side barrios of San Antonio. This is on Culebra Street, a tortilleria that's not there anymore. That's me on the right and two other of my poet friends. We were putting a book together, and this was our photo in our neighborhood. But as I began to look into my own family history, I knew there were these stories. There were these stories about the great-grandmother who had been frightened by an Indian when she was a child. He would throw pebbles at her as she was standing on the banks of the San Antonio River or washing the family clothes. And she was a child, and she would see him throwing these pebbles. She'd get frightened and she'd run away screaming, "Los indios, ahí vienen los indios." Because here, as in New Mexico, as in Old Mexico, the definition between Indian and Mexican was not in race or in heritage. It was about how you dressed, which language you spoke, and which tribal government you listened to. So if you adopted Hispanic cultural ways, you were then better accepted as a Mexican or Mexican American. If you adhered to indigenous ways, then there was shaming that would go in, and fear of savagery, the image that these people were very dangerous. And so there was always the story she told of this man who would throw pebbles at her, laughing. And he wasn't scared, and he wasn't threatening her, and he would watch her scream and run home saying, "Los indios, los indios." The interesting thing is that if you look at the family history, you find the marriages between indigenous and mestizo peoples, and that's where some of the Indio stories come into the family. However, as we look at not only the facial characteristics, but also the genetic heritage that we have. This is my uncle Rosendo, is the baby in the high chair. And it's his family on the west side of San Antonio in the shotgun houses. We look at the features and we recognize that the difference, again, between Mexican American and Indian was in the definitions, the social definitions, not in any sense of reality. I'm lucky. I come from a long line of storytellers. My family loves stories. And so the stories were passed on. And they have been passed on for generations. But there was one person you could always turn to in the family that would tell you all the stories. She was the one who was always whispering, oh, but it was like this. And she would give you 10 times more the information than anybody else. She'd tell you those embarrassing things nobody else wanted to talk about. So if you see here, you see 3 of my aunts. The farthest left is my tia Sara, my Aunt Sarah. And Aunt Sarah was the mischievous one. You can kind of tell in the picture. The others are a little more sedate, but she was the one who was always getting into trouble. But she was a great gossiper, and she would give you absolute detail on everything. So I made, you could call it a mistake or a great discovery. One day when I was about 13, I was already starting to try and assemble a family tree. And the benefit of the family tree was that I could figure out who my cousins were. Because, oh, your cousin Gabe is coming over. Oh, that Gabe, the son of Lot. No, not Gabe, the son of Lot. Gabe, the son of Ernesto, the son of Lot. That other one you're talking about is Gabe, the son of Lot of Ernesto, because all repeated the same name. So you had to know who you were talking about. So I started to write down a tree just so I could figure out who was related how. And in the process of writing the tree, I wanted to put in my grandparents' birth dates and names and all this. And I turned to my Aunt Sarah and I said, Tia, grandma was Eloisa Sanchez, right? She says, yes. Well, and then she begins to tell me a story. This is my grandma Sanchez. And the story, let's go to share screen here and come back so I can kind of give you the story while you're thinking about this. Let me see if we can get this. Stop share. There we go. Okay. One of the things that we try to make happen when we tell stories, we try and give something about the context. So when I heard Tia Sara say, well, I thought, uh-oh, something's happening here. And she says, well, she was a Sanchez, but she was really an Hernandez. And I said, what? And so she starts to tell me the story of this young woman, someone who was a criada in a house in the northeastern part of Mexico. A criada translates as raised. It refers to a child usually who's raised in someone else's house as a servant. So she was a maid, but she was a maid that was kind of owned by the family, and it created a very difficult situation. There was no slavery, but for a very young child who has no form of support or no food, no place to live, to have been sold sometimes, and we now have a more precise word for it, the genízaro heritage of children who were stolen from different ethnicities and resold to other people as servants. If you brought in a child at 5 or 6 years of age, they learned to be scared of you. They learned to do what you wanted them to do. They were enslaved psychologically and emotionally. They felt indebted. They were told things and they had no choice but then to follow them or to leave the house and starve. So this young child, my great grandmother, Natividad Cantú, had gone to live with the Hernandez family when she was very young. I do not know who put her there. I do not know what the specifics were of how she got into the Hernandez house, but she was working there, had already been working there for years when she was 13 or 14 years old, at which point Mr. Hernandez began to rape her. She had no one to complain to. If you are a servant, what do? Go home and tell your family? Your family is your employer. It's the same source, and usually isolated out far away, little house out in the rancho, far away from any authorities. There's no recourse. So she had been raped repeatedly by Mr. Hernandez. And around age 14 or 15, we know that she was 15 when my grandmother was born, she became pregnant. And she was beat, and she was denigrated for this, for being pregnant. But then after a while, she noticed that they began to treat her very nicely. They began to set aside clothing for the baby, little crocheted items. They began to talk about the baby. They began to say, oh, the baby will go in this room, and this is the little cradle for the baby. They talked about the baby a lot. She was a smart young woman. She put two and two together. And she said, they have no children. This is Mr. Hernandez's child. They're going to take this baby and kick me out. And I have no recourse. I can't go to the local sheriff and say, this is what they did to me. He's not going to listen to a criada, who furthermore was called pura India, pure Indian, which implied many things of a class structure, not just a racial structure. It implied that you were therefore lower class and had no education and no honesty, etc. So she knew they wouldn't listen to her. She would be kicked out and her baby would be kept by the Hernandezes. So she made a plan. And on the night that the child was born, late at night, the family was exhausted. Everyone went to bed. She didn't go to bed. She began to pack some tortillas into a cloth. She began to put water into a gourd and to take the blankets that she had used for herself and wrap her baby in them. And she set off at about 4 a.m, before anybody was awake in the house, to walk to the next village. She walked to the next village. And she was hungry, she was thirsty, she was dependent on the kindness, the charity of others. She went door to door asking who wanted to hire her as a maid if they didn't mind her bringing this brand new baby along with her. And a very kind family did take her in. She lived there, she worked for them, she raised her child. And a young man in town, about her age, named Jose Sanchez, had come to deliver some chickens to the family and came back frequently delivering chickens and delivering more and more chickens and bringing things that weren't even ordered by the family, and fell in love with her. And they decided to marry, and he promised he would raise this child as his own. This would be a Sanchez. So that child was my grandmother, Eloisa Sanchez. And that is how we sometimes don't know the stories. I have cousins who say, oh yeah, we're Sanchez on my grandma's side. So they get a coat of arms that says Sanchez and they put it on the wall. And basically that's not just a description of some of my cousins, it's a description of the world. We don't know who our ancestors are unless we do our DNA. And then we only get a little sliver of it. You get what you inherited. And when I looked on my DNA to find out what I inherited, and I went to a source that was very accurate, that could be more specific about things than simply saying, what do they call it? American, I think they call it Central American mix, which means from Arizona down to Colombia, American Indian, and Iberian, which means Spanish. And those things aren't very specific. These people broke it down even more. And there it was. There was the indigenous heritage passed on by DNA from a group that is the very older strain of indigenous peoples in the Americas. So that's sometimes what happens when we go, again, if we look at, let's see if I can do this. Okay, sorry, I'm still all this zooming, and you would think we would be a little faster at this, but we're not. If we go back here and we look again, official histories, who writes them, we even find that as Native peoples who lived in San Antonio before the Spanish flag came to claim it as part of their empire and name it San Antonio, you find that people might be Indian, and in the next census taken 10 years later, they're now mestizo. And in the next census, they come back as Spanish. They have moved their way up in society. So they have officially been designated a certain race, We find that not just with Indigenous stories, we find it with Black stories, we find it with white stories. People pass one way or another into different racial groups. Legislation, again, the Republic of Texas by law declares that, there aren't any Indians, they're all Mexicans, because they look the same. So, that was their answer. And yes, because Mexicans are a mix of Spanish and Indian, we did look the same in their mind. The belittling, the stereotyping, the simplifying, the shaming, the threats, construction, but most importantly, loss of family stories. So I tell people that we have to really focus on our family stories. We have to know, if you aren't lucky enough to have older relatives around, or talkative relatives, or young relatives that talk to older relatives, then one way to capture some of that is to go do some serious study of the area in which your family came from. Whether you're studying San Antonio history or Texas history or Mexican American history or indigenous history, inform yourself as to what the cultural traits are, what the experiences are. You may find things that surprise you, things that didn't make sense before. It was just a mention here, a mention there. But once you start reading about the history of your cultural group, you begin to realize, oh my goodness, that's what they were doing. They were part of the pecan sheller strike, or that's what they were doing. They were part of the group that was escaping because indigenous peoples and Mexican peoples and Black peoples were being lynched through much of Texas history, much of early Texas history. So we have to know part of our bigger history in order to fit our families into that. So I just encourage everyone, don't lose the stories. You may not even think you have any stories until you start to hear other people talk about things that went on with your ethnic group or your community or your city.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You, as the kids say, you dropped so many jewels there. So I definitely hope that people pick it up. Definitely, I loved how you said, I have a aunt that is deep into genealogy, and you are correct. It's all about those oral stories that tell the real story. And you really do have to take a look at who is telling this story, because you really need to take ownership over your own story. Everyone should take ownership of their own story. So I completely agree. Even from you showing, how the name changed once their status in society changed. Everything, my aunt has told me that stuff whenever she's been looking through the family genealogy too. So I completely can understand. So I have a few questions for you. And one is, well, I know you gave a little advice, but do you have any more advice for people who maybe are running into some brick walls or experiencing some challenges when exploring their family genealogy?
Yes, go broad. Go broad. It's just like a map. If you especially in this digital age, we're looking at a map online, and we try and expand it so we can see more in detail. And sometimes we lose everything. We're like, where are we? Have you ever done that? Where you're like, oh, I can't see anything. So you enlarge it and all of a sudden you're lost. And that's what happens too when we're doing research. Sometimes we go so narrow that we can't see what's going on around it. So in that instance, back off and look for context. Context is everything. So say your family came from, Hondo, Texas, and you find out that there was a business in Hondo, Texas that was the top employer of everyone. Or you find out that most people working in the fields picking onions, whatever it was that they were picking. And the more, then you broaden, you go to a bigger base and you study that base. And that gives you background. I'm right now working with the niece of Emma Tanayuka on finishing the long-awaited biography of Emma Tenayuca. And sometimes, not just for the story, but for the context of the story, to understand what the implication was of things, we have to go broad. We have to study what was going on, what were the big things happening in 1938, what were the headlines, and how did this impact how people responded. So same thing with your family history. Talk to everyone you could talk to in your family, but then if there are people that aren't related to you, but they were comadres, they were compadres, they were best friends, they baptized your child, whatever, talk to them too. Talk to people who lived in the same neighborhood. It's funny, those stories are there. And probably the most famous poem I've ever written, it's been published everywhere and in textbooks, and it's been engraved on sidewalks and into museum walls, whatever, is just a little tiny 10-line poem about this very old woman and her mother at the tortilla shop making tortillas. And every once in a while I just drive by that. Oh, all I know is what my experience was when I would walk in and order tortillas from this place. But I just have this habit, 3-4 times a year, I drive by in front of the old building, which is no longer a tortilleria, but it's there, you know, and I stare at it, and I usually take pictures, click, click, and I go back, and, you know, next time I come, it's the same thing, click, click. And I'm touching my roots to make sure they're still there, that they're not going to be torn down or disappear on me. And about a month ago, I was driving past, and I'm going click, click, and then I see a guy in the backyard. And I'm thinking, he's thinking I'm stalking this house, or I don't know, I'm some kind of spy. And so I drive up, I put my mask on right away, and we're at a good distance, but I say to him, I'm sorry, did you know that this used to be a tortilleria? And there was an old woman that sold tortillas here. He says, that was my grandma. And we get to talking. I find out her name. I find out his name. I find out how long they were there. I find out that they had a building someplace else selling tortillas before they went there. It just opened up a whole world. So you have to be stubborn. You have to not give up. Go to cemeteries, maybe the cemetery where you think they're buried, or maybe the cemetery where you know they're buried, but read the names on the stones that are around there. And pretty soon you start to recognize family names. Oh yeah, and San Antonio was a small neighborhood in those days. You know, it's like, oh yeah, the Colungas, we were related to them. You know, and so you find all of these different pieces of the puzzle. And as you collect that information, it's not lost. It's never lost, because you're collecting stories from people that were around your family at that time. They probably knew some of the tragedies that went on down the block with that other family. And so you're collecting part of your communal history. And in the process, little gems come up.
Yes, yes, yes. You definitely, like you said, going back, just talking
Yeah.
to people can completely
Yeah.
open up the world to you. And let's see, we have a question. It says, thank you so much, Doctor. Identity is such a buzzword these days. Why do you think it is so?
We go into fads, and the identity is the word. It's not just these days. People have always wanted to know who they are and where they came from. Right now, it's the latest word is identity for it, but it's gone by other names before. People have an interest in their history because your history is your voice. Your history is the way you connect to everything else in the world. And if you don't know anything about your history, you don't have to know who are my grandparents' names and all this. It'd be nice, but some people don't have that. Some people just, their family didn't tell them, mom wouldn't tell them, dad wouldn't tell them, and they're gone, and there's no choice now but to say, well, I know nothing about my history. But you do know something at a subliminal level. You know values that were passed on, you know beliefs, you know something, you don't know why they have certain beliefs or certain reactions to certain things, but you always have the option to study your history, being that broader community history. It's in newspapers. For peoples of color, sometimes we didn't have the money or the access to newspapers. Sometimes we did, or sometimes we were presented and there's the bad guy. Okay, so we got to remember that those were the way the stories were told, but it has information in there. And don't be ashamed. Don't let anybody shame you. If you had an ancestor that went into jail, it's not something to be ashamed of. It's real life. It's human beings. This is the way things happened. And as we explore everything we can find out about the area they came from, the experiences they might have had, we open up our own possibilities, either because we identify with what we see there, or because we don't identify, or we choose what to identify with. It's empowering. Knowledge is power, and stories are the essence of who we are. So you're learning about them so you can tell your own story. So you can say, you know, beautiful poet Irene Lara Silva says, I come from women rough-skinned and illiterate. She has a whole long poem that goes with it, so you can look it up and see it. But what a beautiful, powerful way to start. The women in her family didn't have it easy. They were rough-skinned because of all the stuff they had to do. They were illiterate, not because they chose to be, but because those doors were never open to them. So take pride in everything you find, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it's our human story. And we are in the process with our lives of writing our own story about who we are. Even if it's by saying, oh, you know, I've always been a procrastinator. I always put things off to the last minute, then I run and get them done real fast. Even when I was born, it took my mom 3 days of labor. And then, man, I came out like in 10 minutes after that, you know. So they're telling you these stories because it means something to them, and because they find a way to connect it with their own identity, with their own emotions and desires and dreams.
Yes, yes. And let's see, I have one more question, and I think we're going to try and finish it off with this question. With all your research that you've done, how would you like to leave a legacy in this community?
Oh, told you that I come from a family of stories. I like stories. My poems have stories. My children's books have stories, and my short stories have stories. I would like to leave behind a few stories that engrave themselves so deeply on people's hearts that they don't forget them, that they take it with them, that it becomes part of them. And if I can do that, then I'll have achieved my goals as a writer.
Great. Yes, I love that. Well, I would like to again thank you for joining us. You have been excellent. I could really listen to you talk and tell stories for about another hour. but but we're not going to do that, not
We
today.
have other people that have their stories to tell as well. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And so is there any way, can you tell us how maybe we could get a hold of you if we would like to ask you some more
Yes. The
questions?
easiest thing is to go on the internet and look for www.carmentafolla.net. Do not go to .com because the Russians hacked it back when they grabbed a whole bunch of websites. I haven't been able to get it back, so it's got something on there about exercise or something, but it's by a non-native speaker of English, and it looks kind of like it's Russian based, and it's owned by somebody in Russia. So anyway, don't go to .com anymore. No, even though it says the real website, the official website of Carmen Tafolla. Don't go to that one. Go to .net, internet net. So remember net. And that one says the real official website of Carmen Tafolla. On there, you'll see my email and information about different books that have come out in the past. And I'm getting ready to update it in the next couple of months because I have a whole bunch more to add on to what's on there already.
Great, great, great. Well, again, thank you for joining us. And I would also like to remind our audience we have many, many more fabulous speakers, some more even just this evening. So I hope that everyone comes back and listens to these to the great speakers. And also I wanted to remind everyone that we still have over 140 activities for you to take part in for our Dream Week celebration. So please go to dreamweek.org, not .com, but .org, and check out some of the many events that we have, and we hope that y'all could join us for another event. So thank you again, Dr. Tafolla, for joining us.
Thank you.